Okay, so thank you. My name's Sam Norris. I'm a professor at the University of Chicago at the Harris School of Public Policy. And I'm very happy to be here to talk about the costs and benefits of incarceration. Now, I should say that this work that I'm going to be talking about today was supported by the National Institute for Justice and the National Science Foundation. Now, it almost goes without saying, but incarceration affects a lot of people and is a very important public policy decision. So today there's about 2 million people that are incarcerated at the state, local, and federal level. But this wasn't always true. So I'm going to give you a 2-minute history of the last 60 years of criminal justice history. So starting in 1960, violent crime rates in the US were low. They were about 100 per 100,000 people. Then starting in the mid-60s, crime rates increased, and by 1990, they were at about 800 per 100,000 people. Now, partially as a response to this, in many different places, policy started changing. And people that previously wouldn't have been incarcerated now were being sent to jail or prison. And so starting in 1970, 1975, the incarceration rate started increasing from about 100, and by 2010 or so, hit 500 per 100,000 people. And so I think there's two important takeaways here, right? So the first is that incarceration is a policy, and there's actually a lot of latitude to incarcerate a lot of people versus not very many people. And so this is something that we should be paying attention to. Now, second, if we squint at this graph, it almost looks like incarceration rates increase, and once they get high enough, the violent crime rate starts to decline. And so you could squint at this and say that if we incarcerate more people, we're going to reduce crime rates. Now, what I'm going to do in this talk is bring a little bit more rigor to trying to understand whether or not that's actually true. So what I'll do is I'll bring new data and new methods to this question. And I'll be talking about the extent to which incarceration reduces crime and the costs and benefits of doing so. Now, before I get into it, I want to talk about what I'm not going to talk about. So we incarcerate people for a whole bunch of reasons, right? So in terms of the benefit, one main benefit of incarceration is that we incapacitate people, which means they're in jail and they're not able to commit more crimes. We also might think that there's behavioral change in that after someone is released, the experience of being in prison is going to make them less likely to commit crimes in the future. Third, we might have a moral reason to incarcerate people, that is increasing justice or enhancing retribution and giving some solace to the victims and their families to incarcerate people. Fourth, there's something called general deterrence, which is the idea that if I'm a potential criminal and I know that if I commit a crime, I'm very likely to get a long sentence, maybe I just won't commit that crime in the first place. Now, on the cost side of the ledger, prison is very expensive. In Ohio, the state that I know the most about, it costs about $26,000 a year. And we also might think that there's costs to incarceration to the family members that be incarcerated and the community members that are left behind. So these are all important reasons why we would want to or not want to incarcerate people. I have nothing to say about the bottom three. So what I'm going to do today is put numbers on the top 4 items. And you should think of what I'm going to tell you as kind of net of all these other issues that I don't have much to contribute on. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we'd like to understand what's going to happen if we incarcerate someone. So we have a bunch of defendants that show up in court, and we want to know what happens when they're incarcerated. So how can we go about doing that? The first thing that we might do is just compare the defendants that are incarcerated with the defendants that aren't incarcerated and ask how many crimes do each of those two groups commit. Now, this isn't likely to give us something like a causal effect because those two groups are already very different. In particular, the defendants who are incarcerated are going to have more prior crimes, more prior convictions. And so even if they hadn't been incarcerated, they'd already be more likely to commit crimes in the future. So we could take a page out of the book of physical scientists and just run a randomized controlled trial. So people show up in court and we flip a coin. If the coin comes up heads, we incarcerate them. If it comes up tails, we don't incarcerate them. Now, this, on the one hand, would be good. Because of the randomization, we know that those two groups would be the same. And so by comparing the crime rates for them, we could learn about the causal effect of incarceration. On the other hand, this is clearly unethical and also impossible. So that leads us to the third option, which is to find a natural experiment or a court where there's already some randomization taking place, and then use that randomization for research purposes. Whoa. So what we do in this paper is we look at the felony and misdemeanor courts in Ohio. And the very nice thing about courts in Ohio is that cases are assigned to judges randomly. So we know that the defendants who are assigned to each judge on average are going to be the same. Now, it turns out that in Ohio, as well as in the US more broadly, judges have a lot of power. So most criminal cases end in a plea deal that's negotiated between the prosecutors and the defense lawyers. But that deal is overseen by the judge. And so if you have a very harsh judge, you can bargain for more time when you're the prosecutor. So the key idea for what we're going to do is we're going to compare the defendants that are assigned to the very lenient judges with the defendants who are assigned to the very harsh judges. And it turns out that that has an enormous impact on whether or not the defendant is actually incarcerated. So what I'm showing you here is a histogram, which is the mean incarceration rate for all the judges in the sample. And so what you can see is that for the very lenient judges, they incarcerate 15% of defendants. For the very harsh ones, they incarcerate nearly 50%. And so by comparing those two groups, we can learn about the effect of incarceration. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is the effect of that judge assignment on whether or not the person is actually incarcerated. And there's two big takeaways here, right? So I'm going to show you that for each quarter since the date that the judge was assigned. And so what you can see is that in the first year to two following the judge assignment, being assigned a severe judge means you're much more likely to be in prison. So 2 quarters after assignment, the people with the severe judge are 80% more likely to be incarcerated. But then we look 2, 3, 4, 5 years out following judge assignment, and now there's no effect of that initial incarceration on whether the defendant is currently incarcerated. So what this means is that any incapacitation effects we would expect would be clustered on the left-hand side, and any behavioral changes will be on the right-hand side. So with that in hand, what I'm showing you here is the effect in each quarter on the cumulative number of crimes that the defendant has committed from the time that the judge was assigned. And so what you can see is that in that first year to two following judge assignment, the defendants who are incarcerated are much less likely to commit crimes. So that's the very steep downward part of the curve. And there's a simple answer, and it's that they happen to be incarcerated. Now, the other thing that's important to see is that 2, 3, 4, 5 years later, there's no further change in the number of crimes committed as a result of incarceration. So there's no evidence that the behavior of the defendants is changing after they're released from prison. Okay, so what we've done so far is we've figured out the amount of time that someone is going to be incarcerated for when they're sent to prison. And we figured out how many crimes that is going to avert. So we want to put that together. And so what we're going to do is conduct a cost-benefit analysis. We know that incarceration costs about $26,000 a year in Ohio. And then to evaluate the cost of the crime averted, we're going to put a dollar value on each crime. Now, there's disagreement about exactly how costly crime is. So we search through the literature and take the high and the low values in terms of the social cost of a crime that might be committed. So for an assault, that ranges from $45,000 in social cost to $120,000 in social cost. And then we can think about the high and the low potential valuations in terms of a cost benefit. Now, this graph is almost a mirror of the one that I showed you of the effect on crimes committed. where the blue area here is representing the change in net cost as a function of that initial incarceration. And in the same way that incarceration reduces the number of crimes in the first couple of years, we see a steep decline in the net cost, right? So the net cost is negative, meaning that we've averted a bunch of crimes and that has a positive benefit. Then after 2 years or so, there's no further change. By the end of 7 or 8 years, we've averted maybe $8,000 to $13,000 in crime. Now, the other side of the ledger is the cost of incarcerating people. That's the red line here. And you can see again that that steeply increases in the first few years when people are incarcerated and then flattens out as they're released. So the cost benefit is just to add those two numbers together. And when we do so, we see that the net cost of incarcerating someone ends up being positive for both the high and the low potential valuations for crime. At the end of the day, we're looking at a net cost of incarcerating someone of somewhere between $6,000 and $12,000. We can add in some statistical uncertainty, and where we land is that we can't reject that there's no net benefit, but we can reject that there's a very large benefit of incarcerating people. Okay, now the next thing that I want to talk about is what about other costs to the family members of the defendant? So we expect that incarceration is going to affect the family members of the defendants, and in fact we expect that incarceration is going to make those children much worse off, and that might make us less likely to want to incarcerate defendants. So using the exact same identification strategy or research strategy, we look at the same question and look at the effect of someone's parent being incarcerated on the outcomes for that child. And we find the exact opposite of what the conventional wisdom is, which is that parental incarceration seems to make children less likely to commit crimes themselves when they're adults and less likely to be incarcerated. We also use a measure of socioeconomic status, which is based on the neighborhood that the child lives in as an adult, and we find that incarceration increases the socioeconomic status of the child. So with that in hand, we'd like to add that into the cost benefit. So we start out with the crime costs for the adults, and then we're going to, in the exact same way, provide evaluation for the crime-reducing benefits on the children and the SES benefits. Once we scale those by the number of kids that are caught up in the justice system, what we find is that the net benefit to children of parental incarceration is somewhere between $3,000 and $6,000. And so we can add that on to the benefits that come from incarcerating the adults. On the other hand, we have to weigh that against the cost of the marginal incarceration, which is $18,000 in Ohio. And so when we add all those things together, we land on a net cost of incarceration of somewhere between $8,000 and negative $700. So under most valuations of the potential cost of crime, we conclude that the cost of incarcerating someone is higher than the net social benefit. So that is what I wanted to talk about today. So what we do here is we show how we can use quasi-experiments to estimate a causal effect of incarceration on crime and other outcomes. What we find is that incarceration reduces the number of crimes committed over the next 8 years by about 0.6. But despite this benefit in terms of reduced crime, that seems to be outweighed by the very high cost of incarceration. Surprisingly, it turns out that children also modestly benefit from their parents being incarcerated, at least in this particular sample. But these benefits are unlikely to outweigh the high cost of incarceration. The last thing that I wanted to say, but won't go into, and this is in your slide packets, is that I've collected some other recent work, which is about incarceration, about criminal justice policies that seem to work, and so that is something that might be useful to look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Jeff?
To
really excellent and provocative presentations. I know you're all dying to ask questions, but I think it's my prerogative to ask the first two, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it. Bear with me. So Sam, very rigorous analysis. The overall finding is that incarceration is not cost beneficial, yes. I would argue that it's even less cost beneficial than you said for two reasons. One is, I don't think your models included the cost of the crimes that happen behind bars, correct?
They would if they ended up in the courts.
Yeah, I can assure you they don't.
Yes.
Yeah, so I just think it's important to know, like, incarceration doesn't necessarily mean that crime goes away. There's a lot of horrible things that happen behind bars. There are victimizations that occur that often don't come to the light of day, aren't counted, but still have costs. They have cost to the system, cost to the individual, and cost to society. And then my second question / comment is around this, for me, rather troubling finding that incarceration of a parent benefits the child, and I'm sure you've encountered, some strong reactions to that. My reactions have to do with what I know about the literature about impact on behavior, educational impact, psychological impact. There's a lot there to unpack. I'm guessing that you were unable to put a price tag on those types of impacts. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. So we think that there's big psychological impacts of parental incarceration, and this is kind of another thing that is fully outside what we can put numbers on.
Mm-hmm. But if you were able to quantify it and include it, it would mean that incarceration was even less cost beneficial.
I think that's probably right. I mean, I don't think it's right that every child is facing psychological harm when their parent is incarcerated. Often they're going to live in a more stable environment, typically with grandparents or with the non-criminally involved parent. And so for those children, I think that it is likely to be even a psychological benefit. If we add it all up, though, yeah, I think it's likely that you would end up with another net negative.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Thank you. All right, Jeff, on to you. I loved your research and your findings. In part, maybe it's narcissistic because so much of what you found mirrors what we found many years ago with our own longitudinal study of reentry, particularly around the residential mobility and the both good and bad reasons why people moved, right? And like some people moved because they intentionally didn't want to go back on the same street corner with the same negative influences, right? But that also meant that they were moving further away, potentially, from their families and that family support. Some people moved away from their original neighborhoods because their families were forced out because they couldn't afford to stay there because their family member was incarcerated and they were a main breadwinner, right? There's a lot to unpack here that I think has policy implications. I'd love to hear your response to that, and also we found some distinct differences in degree and level and type of family support for men returning home from prison versus women. I'm wondering if you found similar themes.
Great question. I think you had more ability in your study to disentangle the effects on men or women. We had a very small sample. I think I would say that one thing I guess I touched on a little bit was that women do face I think when they're part of a couple, they often face that threat of coercion a lot more than men do. That they're with guys who are bad influences on them. I don't know what the gender differences. I'd like to hear more about your gender differences. But more generally, I'd like to unpack that whole. What do we make out of all this? I think that one thing is. That paradox that I pointed out about like withdrawing from the community as a strategy of intentional social isolation can be beneficial in the short run maybe, but damaging in the long run. I think that since we're on Capitol Hill and thinking about federal roles in this, I think that supports for families who are shouldering that burden of reintegration are a mechanism that we should all be thinking about more. As we know, people coming out of prison are ineligible for a lot of benefits. But we should be thinking of ways of trying to help the families who are really trying to provide that housing and that food and everything else, and through federal benefits. that's the beginnings of an answer.
Yeah, so our study found that men were more likely to have all manner of family support. And nearly all the men had a woman in their lives, right?
Yeah.
It might be an aunt, a mother, a grandmother, an intimate partner. They always had someone, right?
Yep.
The women who came out, largely, if they had family support, they were relying on their adult children for it. I think that probably holds true with your research.
Yeah, that even with our small sample, but same dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Great. I will not hog the podium anymore. I'm sure many of you have questions. Who's first? Don't make a liar of me. Oh, yes.
How you doing, Sam? My name is Dominic. I know this is probably a touchy subject, but touchy thing to say we'll talk about. But you mentioned that the mass incarceration happened in terms of the 1960s, and it grew. Do you think that, because the bottom line is this, and it hurts me, African American, especially African American men, are more incarcerated than their Caucasian inmates. So do you think that the harsh treatment that African Americans went through on the civil rights movement, like Dr. King going to jail or anybody going to jail, do you think that that's part of the reason why there was a decline, not a decline, but an increase in mass incarceration? I'm not asking you to be political now, but I'm just saying, do you think it's possible?
No, I mean, I think it's clear that criminal justice policy in the U.S. is very racialized, and it's not possible to separate those things out. Right? Like, I'm not an expert on it, but we know from recent history, for example, that crack cocaine was penalized at 100 times the rate of regular cocaine, and that there's a clear racial angle there. And so I think it would be silly to say that there was no racial angle at anything that happened before that.
Put another way, the criminal justice system is an extension of our history of slavery and lynching and Jim Crow. That's my take on it. Others?
I spent some time both in New Hampshire and then conversely in Louisiana, which I'm not sure if this relates to y'all's studies, but they're very opposite sides of the spectrum in regards to public education systems. New Hampshire and the Northeast states generally have a higher rate of public education versus Louisiana and some of those deep southern states having lower rates of that. Could you talk on the cost of that? Because that would be like a preemptive strike time to that deal. Can you educate the population better? Could you increase that cost, or conversely, coming back from incarceration, how could you relate public education to a policy that might help reintegration?
Yeah, I can say. So I would say. So I can't speak to these differences across different states, based on the quality of the school systems there. But I do. I think that education is a very key component here in thinking about, first of all, who ends up in prison, but then also what their chances are after getting out. And one of the policy levers that we really write about and endorse is like trying to get more access to higher education, especially for people in prison, which I think is really critical. And it's critical. So there's several reasons that it's important. And one of them, as a professor and other people here on the panel who are professors, we like to think it's all about all the wisdom that we impart to people. It's not all about that. I mean, there's also the more symbolic aspect of having put yourself, having made the sacrifice and have the determination to go and get a degree, and what that signals to employers, for example, about what kind of potential employee you would be. And I have some colleagues who write about this idea of signaling theory in economics, about like how education is one means that people have to send a signal that they would be a strong employee. But people coming out of prison are kind of denied that opportunity a lot. And one of the interesting, what's somewhat disappointing as a finding is that job training programs, when you look at randomized control trials, don't have a lot of impact on chances of finding work and having a high income after prison. On the other hand, a lot of people who go through job training programs get placed in work, and they have very high placement rates, and they look successful. It's just when you look at them through the lens of a randomized control trial, they appear to be unsuccessful. So to make sense out of those two findings, it could be the idea that what's happening is that people who would be more likely to find work to begin with are going into those job training programs, and they're providing people the opportunity to send that signal, and they are getting hired because they set aside some income that they could have had more immediately, maybe because they put themselves through this training program, and this was their credential coming out that sent a signal to employers that I really am committed to changing myself and to being a good employee. So I think that having more opportunities to send signals like that to employers is a really important thing.
Yeah, and let me follow up on that. There's also just this question of timing that kind of disappointingly doing job training for people that are just getting out of prison doesn't really work. But we do know that investing in education earlier on tends to have higher returns. And so my colleague Jim Heckman at UChicago has done a lot of work on programs in the 60s and 70s that provided very intense structured support for low-income families. So this is the Perry preschool program, most famously. And what we see is that the kids that got those supports ended up committing fewer crimes in the future. And so I think that kind of pushing back when we're doing the educational investments can increase the benefits.
And I would just add another angle to it, which is that one hypothesis is that some of these job training programs aren't working because they're only looking at one piece in the puzzle, right? Everyone's like, oh, we just have to get them a job and it'll be okay, not recognizing that they might have long and serious histories with substance use disorders and other issues that make it very hard to find and keep a job. So, in some of the literature that we've looked at, my conclusion is that you really need to take both a holistic approach to supporting people in reentry, but also a tailored one that responds to their unique needs and also assets. I'm going to take one more question, and then we're going to have to close.
Thank you. I'm just wondering what you think those who are mentally ill who get incarcerated, should they be incarcerated or put in a hospital? I ask this because 46% of those in the federal prison system are mentally ill, and do you think it'd be more beneficial for them to go to a hospital versus being incarcerated?
So I haven't done any specific research on this, but I can just tell you that, I'm aware this is a big issue. Mental illness also goes, unfortunately, hand in hand with substance use a lot, and that was something that, we knew going into our study that substance use was going to be an issue. We didn't know how big of an issue it was. On the other hand, mental illness is not necessarily very correlated with the likelihood of committing a violent crime after prison. So, but the people who are mentally ill, the conditions of incarceration are just awful. And spending time in solitary, especially, if you have mental illness going in, can be just life damaging. So I think that the more that we can divert people from prison, the better off most people will be, especially for mentally ill.
Okay, well, we're done, right? Is this time up? Okay. Thank you so much. You've been a great audience.